The ripple effects of Ghana's success were spreading across Africa faster than anyone had anticipated. By the program's first anniversary, 7 other African nations had submitted similar proposals to the IMF, each adapted to address their specific challenges while following Ghana's model of linking international support to measurable development outcomes rather than traditional austerity measures. The transformation was reshaping not just individual countries, but the entire relationship between Africa and the global financial system. In Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, the government had watched Ghana's progress with initial skepticism that gradually transformed into genuine interest. Nigeria's oil-dependent economy had struggled for decades with corruption, infrastructure deficits, and an inability to diversify beyond petroleum exports. The success of Ghana's transparency initiatives and renewable energy programs provided a roadmap for addressing similar challenges in Nigeria, where massive oil wealth had failed to translate into broad-based prosperity for the population. President Bola Tinubu personally led a high-level delegation to Accra to study Ghana's digital tax collection system and renewable energy programs. The visit resulted in Nigeria submitting a $2.8 billion proposal to the IMF that focused on petroleum sector transparency, renewable energy development, and economic diversification. The proposal included commitments to publish all oil contracts online, implement blockchain tracking for petroleum revenues, and invest heavily in solar power to reduce Nigeria's dependence on expensive fuel imports for electricity generation. Kenya had moved even more quickly, leveraging its existing strengths in mobile technology and renewable energy to secure approval for a $1.2 billion program that would accelerate the country's transformation into a regional technology hub. Kenya's proposal built on its already impressive progress in mobile money and digital governance, with ambitious targets for expanding internet access to rural areas and establishing world-class technology universities that would serve students from across East Africa. The most surprising development was South Africa's decision to request technical assistance in adapting Ghana's model to address its own economic challenges. Despite being Africa's most developed economy, South Africa had struggled with high unemployment, persistent inequality, and chronic electricity shortages. The success of Ghana's renewable energy program offered solutions to South Africa's power crisis, while Ghana's approach to improving government efficiency provided insights for addressing corruption and improving public service delivery. The transformation extended beyond individual country programs to fundamental changes in how international financial institutions approached African development. The World Bank announced a new Africa Innovation Fund that would provide flexible financing for countries implementing governance and transparency reforms, similar to those pioneered by Ghana. The African Development Bank restructured its lending programs to prioritize institutional development over traditional infrastructure projects, recognizing that sustainable development required strong governance foundations. European donor countries were also adapting their aid programs to reflect lessons learned from Ghana's success. The United Kingdom launched a new partnership program that provided technical assistance and private sector investment opportunities for countries implementing transparency and governance reforms. Germany expanded its renewable energy partnerships with African countries, while France began restructuring its traditional aid relationships to focus more on capacity building and less on direct budget support. The changes were having profound effects on African capital markets and private sector development. International investors previously reluctant to commit significant resources to African markets due to concerns about governance and transparency were beginning to view the continent differently. Ghana's success in implementing transparent, accountable governance systems was demonstrating that African countries could be reliable partners for long-term investment. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the technology sector, where Ghana's investment in digital infrastructure and education was producing remarkable results. Accra was emerging as a major technology hub, with startup companies developing innovative solutions for challenges across Africa. Mobile applications developed by Ghanaian companies were being used to improve healthcare delivery in rural Nigeria, facilitate cross-border trade in West Africa, and provide educational resources to students in countries across the continent. The success was creating a positive feedback loop that attracted additional investment and talent. Young African professionals who had emigrated to Europe and North America were beginning to return home, drawn by opportunities in the growing technology sector and confidence in improved governance systems. The brain drain that had plagued Africa for decades was beginning to reverse, with countries like Ghana becoming destinations for skilled workers from across the continent. However, the rapid expansion of Ghana model programs across Africa was also creating new challenges and concerns. Some economists worried that the IMF was abandoning its traditional focus on fiscal discipline in favor of politically popular, but potentially unsustainable development programs. Critics argued that the success in Ghana might not be replicable in countries with weaker institutional foundations or different economic structures. The concerns intensified when Zambia's attempt to implement a similar program faced significant difficulties. Despite securing IMF approval for an innovative debt restructuring program modeled on Ghana's approach, Zambia struggled to implement the transparency and accountability mechanisms that had been crucial to Ghana's success. Political opposition, weak administrative capacity, and entrenched corruption networks made it difficult to achieve the rapid improvements that had characterized Ghana's program. The Zambian experience highlighted the importance of political will and institutional readiness for successful implementation of innovative development programs. Ghana's success had been built on years of democratic governance, relatively strong institutions, and broad political consensus around the need for economic transformation. Countries lacking these foundations might require different approaches or more extensive preparatory work before attempting similar programs. Despite these challenges, the momentum behind the Ghana model continued to build. The African Union formally endorsed the approach and established a Continental Development Finance Initiative to help member countries design and implement innovative financing programs. The initiative included technical assistance for institutional development, peer learning networks to share best practices, and advocacy with international partners to secure support for African-led development strategies. The transformation was also changing Africa's relationship with China, which had become the continent's largest trading partner and investor through the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese officials, initially concerned that the Ghana model might reduce African interest in Chinese investment, began adapting their own approach to emphasize transparency and mutual benefit. Several Chinese companies partnered with African governments implementing Ghana-style programs, providing technology and expertise while committing to the same transparency standards required by international development partners. As Ghana's program entered its second year, the country had become a symbol of African innovation and self-determination. The success was inspiring a new generation of African leaders who viewed their countries not as aid recipients, but as partners in global development. The transformation extended far beyond economics to include a fundamental shift in how Africans viewed their continent's potential and their relationship with the rest of the world. 6 months after the historic IMF approval, Ghana was beginning to show signs of the transformation that skeptics had dismissed as impossible. In the sprawling Kantamanto market in Accra, one of West Africa's largest commercial hubs, vendors were reporting their first profitable quarters in over 2 years. The national currency had stabilized. Inflation was dropping month by month, and most importantly, ordinary Ghanaians were beginning to see tangible improvements in their daily lives. The transformation was most visible in Ghana's approach to tax collection, which had been revolutionized through the implementation of a comprehensive digital system. For decades, the country had struggled with tax evasion and corruption in revenue collection, with many businesses operating entirely in cash to avoid government scrutiny. The new system, built with support from the IMF program, used advanced data analytics to identify tax compliance patterns and streamline the collection process for honest businesses, while making it much harder for tax evaders to hide their activities. Kwame Mensah, a small business owner who ran a successful textile import company, had initially feared that increased tax compliance would hurt his bottom line. Instead, he discovered that the new digital system actually reduced his administrative burden, while ensuring that his competitors who had been avoiding taxes could no longer undercut his prices unfairly. The level playing field created by effective tax enforcement had revitalized legitimate businesses across multiple sectors, The renewable energy program was exceeding even the most optimistic projections. Ghana's partnership with international solar and wind power companies had resulted in the rapid construction of major renewable energy facilities across the country. The Boy Solar Power Plant, built with technical support from German engineers and financing arranged through the IMF program, was generating clean electricity for over 100,000 homes, while creating thousands of jobs for local workers who had been trained in renewable energy technology. Perhaps most remarkably, the frequent power outages that had plagued Ghana for years were becoming increasingly rare. The combination of new renewable energy generation and improved grid management had dramatically increased the reliability of electricity supply. Manufacturing companies that had been forced to invest in expensive backup generators were now able to operate more efficiently, reducing costs and increasing competitiveness in regional markets. The education component of the program was producing equally impressive results. Ghana had used IMF funding to launch an ambitious digital literacy initiative that provided tablets and internet access to students in rural schools that had previously lacked basic educational resources. Teachers who had never used computers were receiving intensive training in digital education tools, while students were gaining access to online learning platforms that connected them to educational opportunities around the world. In the northern region, where poverty rates had historically been highest, the impact was particularly dramatic. Students like Fatima, a 16-year-old who had dreamed of becoming a software engineer despite having never used a computer, were now taking advanced programming courses online. The digital divide that had separated rural Ghana from urban opportunities was beginning to close, creating possibilities that had been unimaginable just months earlier. The healthcare improvements were saving lives on a scale that impressed even seasoned development professionals. Ghana had used program funds to establish a network of community health centers, equipped with telemedicine technology, that connected rural patients to specialist doctors in major hospitals. Mothers in remote villages who previously would have lost children to preventable diseases were now receiving expert medical advice through video, consultations with pediatricians in Accra and Kumasi. The program's emphasis on transparency and accountability was producing unexpected benefits, beyond simply preventing corruption. The real-time tracking system that monitored every dollar of IMF funding had become a model for managing domestic government spending as well. Citizens could access online dashboards that showed exactly how their tax money was being used, creating unprecedented public oversight of government activities and building trust between leaders and citizens. International observers were taking notice of Ghana's progress, but not everyone was celebrating. Some traditional IMF economists worried that the program's success might encourage other countries to abandon fiscal discipline in pursuit of similar arrangements. There were concerns that Ghana's apparent success was built on unsustainable spending that would eventually lead to an even worse crisis. Critics pointed out that 6 months was too short a time to judge the long-term viability of such an ambitious reform program. However, the economic indicators were increasingly positive across all sectors. Foreign direct investment was flowing into Ghana at levels not seen since the discovery of oil a decade earlier. International companies were establishing regional headquarters in Accra, attracted by improved infrastructure, a skilled workforce, and a government that was proving its commitment to transparency and efficiency. The Ghana Stock Exchange was experiencing unprecedented growth as investor confidence returned. The technology sector was emerging as a particularly bright spot in Ghana's economic transformation. The country's investment in coding boot camps and startup incubators was producing a new generation of software developers and entrepreneurs who were building applications and services for markets across Africa. Ghana's mobile money system, already one of the most advanced in the world, was being expanded to include new financial services that were increasing access to credit and investment opportunities for small businesses. African leaders were watching Ghana's progress with intense interest. Nigeria's finance minister had visited Accra 3 times to study the implementation of various program components, while delegations from Kenya, Rwanda, and Senegal were preparing their own innovative propo. The decision that would change the course of African economic history came on a rainy Thursday morning in November 2024. Kristalina Georgieva stood before the IMF's executive board, a document in her hands that represented either the dawn of a new era in international development finance or a dangerous gamble with global economic stability. After months of intense negotiations, late-night phone calls with world leaders, and careful analysis of Ghana's reform proposals, the moment of truth had arrived. The boardroom was unusually packed, with representatives from major world economies, understanding that this decision would set precedents far beyond Ghana's borders. The Chinese representative sat quietly in the corner, knowing that approval of Ghana's innovative program could challenge Beijing's growing influence in Africa through traditional infrastructure loans. European delegates were divided, with some supporting the new approach as a way to counter Chinese influence, while others worried about the financial risks of abandoning proven lending practices. Georgieva began her presentation by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of Ghana's request. Never before had the IMF considered a program that prioritized long-term institutional development over immediate fiscal adjustment. The traditional model had always been simple. Countries in crisis would receive emergency funding in exchange for implementing austerity measures designed to restore macroeconomic stability as quickly as possible. Ghana was asking the IMF to trust that a different path could achieve better results. The numbers Ghana had presented were compelling. Their economic team, led by brilliant technocrats educated at top universities around the world, had developed sophisticated models showing how investments in education and healthcare could generate higher long-term returns than traditional fiscal consolidation. They projected that improving tax collection efficiency through digital systems could increase government revenue by 40% within 3 years, while investments in renewable energy could reduce foreign currency outflows by $2 billion annually. However, the real breakthrough in the negotiations had come when Ghana agreed to an unprecedented level of transparency and accountability. Every dollar of the $367 million would be tracked through blockchain technology, allowing real-time monitoring of how funds were being used. Independent auditors from international firms would provide quarterly reports, and civil society organizations would be given access to monitor program implementation. Ghana had essentially agreed to operate under a microscope, with every aspect of their reform program subject to international scrutiny. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than many had expected. 17 countries voted in favor, 8 voted against, and 3 abstained. The United States, United Kingdom, and Germany provided crucial support, while France and Japan expressed reservations about abandoning fiscal discipline. China's vote in favor surprised many observers, with Beijing apparently deciding that supporting African innovation was more important than defending traditional lending practices that had failed to produce the stability that China needed for its own investments in the region. As news of the approval spread across Ghana, celebrations erupted in the streets of Accra, Kumasi, and other major cities. For the first time in years, there was genuine hope that the economic crisis might be ending. Market vendors who had watched their businesses struggle cheered as the national currency began to strengthen on news of the IMF approval. University students, many of whom had been planning to emigrate after graduation, began discussing opportunities to contribute to their country's transformation. President Akufo-Addo addressed the nation from the Jubilee House that evening, speaking directly to the camera with an intensity that reflected the magnitude of the moment. He acknowledged that Ghana had been given an extraordinary opportunity, but emphasized that success would depend on every citizen's commitment to the reform process. The president announced the creation of citizen oversight committees that would monitor program implementation at the local level, ensuring that the benefits of international support would reach ordinary Ghanaians rather than being captured by corrupt officials. The international reaction was immediate and intense. Development economists around the world began analyzing the Ghana model, with some hailing it as a breakthrough in North-South cooperation and others warning that it could lead to fiscal irresponsibility. The Financial Times published a lengthy editorial arguing that the IMF had abandoned its core mission of ensuring fiscal discipline, while The Economist cautiously praised the innovative approach, while noting the significant risks involved. African leaders watched Ghana's experiment with intense interest, understanding that success could open similar opportunities for their own countries. Nigeria's president privately instructed his finance minister to begin developing a similar proposal focused on petroleum sector reform and economic diversification. Kenya's government accelerated its own negotiations with international partners, hoping to secure additional funding for its ambitious infrastructure and technology programs. The immediate challenges facing Ghana were enormous. The $367 million, while significant, was only the beginning of what would be needed to transform the economy. The real test would be whether Ghana could use this initial funding to build the institutional capacity needed to attract much larger investments from private sector partners. The program included specific targets for improving the business environment, with commitments to reduce bureaucratic red tape and strengthen the rule of law. One of the most innovative aspects of the program was its focus on building Ghana's technology sector as a driver of economic growth. The country had already shown impressive progress in mobile money and digital payments, with more Ghanaians having access to mobile banking than traditional bank accounts. The IMF program would provide additional support for technology incubators, coding boot camps, and startup accelerators designed to position Ghana as a major technology hub for West Africa. The renewable energy component of the program was equally ambitious. Ghana committed to generating 40% of its electricity from renewable sources within 5 years, a target that many experts considered unrealistic, given the country's limited experience with solar and wind power. However, the program included partnerships with leading international renewable energy companies that would provide both technical expertise and private sector investment to complement the IMF funding. As the first disbursement of funds was prepared, Ghana's leadership understood that the world was watching their every move. Success would prove that African nations could be trusted with innovative approaches to development finance, potentially revolutionizing how international institutions engaged with developing countries. Failure would reinforce stereotypes about African governance and make it much harder for other nations to negotiate similar agreements. The pressure was immense, but so was the opportunity to change the trajectory of an entire continent. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the International Monetary Fund headquarters in Washington, D.C. as senior economists gathered for what they thought would be another routine meeting about African debt restructuring. Little did they know that a small West African nation was about to shake the very foundations of global financial policy. Ghana's finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, had been flying between Accra and Washington for months, carrying with him a proposal that would either save his country or plunge it deeper into economic chaos. The numbers on his laptop screen told a story of desperation: inflation soaring past 50%, the national currency losing value faster than water through a broken dam, and millions of Ghanaians watching their life savings evaporate. The cocoa farms that had once made Ghana the world's second-largest producer were struggling. Farmers like Kwame Asante, who had worked the same land for 30 years, found themselves unable to afford the fertilizers and pesticides needed to maintain their crops. In the bustling markets of Accra, women who had built thriving businesses selling everything from textiles to electronics were closing their stalls one by one. The middle class that Ghana had spent decades building was crumbling. President Nana Akufo-Addo knew that conventional solutions weren't working. Traditional IMF programs had failed across Africa for decades, creating cycles of debt that trapped countries in poverty while demanding austerity measures that hurt the very people they were supposed to help. Ghana needed something different, something bold, something that had never been tried before on this scale. The president's economic team had spent countless nights in the Jubilee House, Ghana's presidential palace, crafting a revolutionary approach to debt restructuring. They weren't just asking for money. They were proposing a fundamental shift in how international financial institutions dealt with African nations. Their plan would tie loan conditions not to traditional austerity measures, but to measurable improvements in education, healthcare, and sustainable development. As Ofori-Atta prepared for the crucial meeting with IMF officials, he carried with him letters from ordinary Ghanaians. There was the letter from Akosua, a single mother in Kumasi who had seen her small restaurant fail because customers could no longer afford to eat out. There was the message from Dr. Emmanuel Ose, who ran a rural clinic and watched helplessly as medical supplies became too expensive to import. These weren't just statistics in a government report. They were real people whose lives hung in the balance. The IMF boardroom fell silent as Ofori-Atta began his presentation. He didn't start with economic projections or debt-to-GDP ratios. Instead, he told the story of Ghana's journey from colonial exploitation through independence, from periods of military rule to democratic stability, and finally to this moment of crisis and opportunity. He spoke of a nation that had peacefully transferred power between political parties for over 2 decades, a rarity in a region often plagued by political instability. The proposal Ghana presented was audacious in its scope. They weren't asking for a traditional bailout that would saddle future generations with unsustainable debt. They were requesting a $367 million package structured as a partnership rather than a loan. The funds would be tied to specific development outcomes, with Ghana committing to transparent reporting and measurable progress in key sectors. What made this proposal revolutionary was its focus on building institutional capacity, rather than simply providing temporary financial relief. Ghana promised to use the funds to strengthen its tax collection system, improve government transparency, and invest in renewable energy infrastructure that would reduce the country's dependence on expensive fuel imports. They committed to educational reforms that would prepare young Ghanaians for the jobs of the future, and healthcare improvements that would reduce the devastating impact of preventable diseases. The IMF officials listened with growing interest as Ofori-Atta outlined how this approach would break the cycle of debt dependence that had trapped so many African nations. Traditional programs often focused on short-term stabilization at the cost of long-term growth, forcing governments to cut spending on education and healthcare just when their people needed these services most. Ghana's proposal flipped this model, arguing that sustainable economic growth required investment in human capital and institutional development. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as the presentation concluded. Some officials were skeptical, having seen similar promises from other countries that had failed to deliver results. Others were intrigued by the innovative approach and the detailed implementation plan that Ghana had prepared. The proposal included specific timelines, measurable targets, and accountability mechanisms that went far beyond what was typically required in IMF agreements. As the meeting adjourned, Ofori-Atta knew that the real work was just beginning. Ghana had thrown down the gauntlet, challenging the international financial community to think differently about development aid and debt restructuring. The response from the IMF would determine not just Ghana's economic future, but potentially reshape how international financial institutions engaged with developing nations across Africa and beyond. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would prove that African nations could be trusted partners in their own development, capable of innovative solutions to complex problems. Failure would reinforce stereotypes about African governance and potentially close the door on similar initiatives for years to come. Ghana had bet everything on a new approach to international finance, and the world was watching to see if this small West African nation could pull off what many considered impossible. The weeks following Ghana's revolutionary proposal to the IMF were filled with intense behind-the-scenes negotiations that would reshape the landscape of international development finance. In conference rooms across Washington, D.C., London, and other financial capitals, economists and policymakers debated whether Ghana's innovative approach could actually work or if it was simply another desperate attempt by a struggling nation to avoid harsh economic medicine. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva found herself at the center of a heated debate within the IMF. Traditional economists argued that Ghana's proposal lacked the strict fiscal discipline that had been the cornerstone of IMF programs for decades. They pointed to countless examples of African governments that had made similar promises only to fall back into old patterns of corruption and mismanagement once the international spotlight dimmed. The skeptics worried that approving Ghana's request would set a dangerous precedent, encouraging other nations to demand similar treatment without the institutional capacity to deliver results. However, a growing faction within the IMF was beginning to question whether the traditional approach was actually working. Countries like Greece had received multiple bailouts under conventional programs, only to see their economies shrink and their debt burdens become even more unsustainable. In contrast, nations that had been given more flexibility in their reform programs, such as Rwanda and Botswana, had shown remarkable progress in building sustainable economies and improving living standards for their citizens. The debate extended far beyond the IMF's marble corridors. In universities across America and Europe, Development economists were publishing papers arguing that the Washington Consensus had failed Africa. Professor Joseph Stiglitz of Columbia University and other Nobel laureates publicly supported Ghana's approach, arguing that sustainable development required investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, rather than the austerity measures that had dominated international lending for the previous 4 decades. Meanwhile, in Accra, President Akufo-Addo was facing intense pressure from multiple directions. Opposition politicians accused him of selling Ghana's sovereignty to international creditors, while some members of his own party worried that the ambitious reform program would be impossible to implement, given the country's limited administrative capacity. Street protests erupted in several cities as rumors spread about potential tax increases and subsidy cuts that might be required under any IMF agreement. The president's advisors worked around the clock to address concerns from various stakeholders while maintaining the integrity of their original proposal. They organized town hall meetings in major cities, allowing ordinary Ghanaians to voice their concerns and ask questions about the proposed reforms. Dr. Mahamudu Bawumia, the vice president and former central banker, led many of these sessions, explaining in clear terms how the program would differ from previous IMF interventions that had failed to deliver lasting benefits. One particularly contentious issue was the proposed reform of Ghana's energy sector. The country had been struggling with expensive fuel imports that drained foreign currency reserves, while frequent power outages disrupted businesses and reduced productivity. Ghana's proposal included ambitious targets for renewable energy development, with specific commitments to solar and wind power projects that would reduce dependence on imported fossil fuels. Critics argued that these technologies were too expensive and unreliable for a developing country, while supporters pointed to successful renewable energy programs in countries like Morocco and Kenya. The negotiations took an unexpected turn when several other African nations began expressing interest in similar programs. Nigeria, facing its own economic challenges despite vast oil wealth, quietly approached the IMF about adapting Ghana's model to address corruption in the petroleum sector and diversify the economy beyond oil exports. Kenya's government, already making significant progress in renewable energy and digital innovation, saw an opportunity to accelerate their development goals through a similar partnership approach. This groundswell of interest caught IMF officials off guard and added pressure to get Ghana's program right. If successful, the Ghana model could become a template for transforming development finance across Africa. If it failed spectacularly, it would reinforce arguments that African governments could not be trusted with flexible loan conditions and would make it much harder for other nations to negotiate innovative agreements in the future. The breakthrough came during a private meeting between Georgieva and several African finance ministers who were attending the World Bank's annual meetings in October. The ministers presented a united front, arguing that the traditional IMF approach had created a generation of African leaders who were more accountable to international creditors than to their own people. They demanded a new partnership model that would respect African agency while maintaining appropriate safeguards for international funds. Georgieva was particularly moved by the testimony of Rwanda's finance minister, who described how his country had rebuilt from the devastation of genocide by focusing on long-term institution building rather than short-term fiscal targets. He argued that Ghana deserved the same opportunity to chart its own course toward sustainable development, supported by international partners who understood that lasting change required patience and flexibility. The political dynamics shifted further when several major donor countries began expressing support for Ghana's approach. The United Kingdom, seeking to redefine its relationship with former colonies after Brexit, saw an opportunity to demonstrate a more enlightened approach to development aid. Germany, already committed to sustainable development goals, appreciated Ghana's focus on renewable energy and climate resilience. Even the United States, traditionally more conservative in its approach to international lending, recognized that new approaches were needed to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was gaining influence across Africa through massive infrastructure investments. As winter approached in Washington, the pressure mounted on all sides to reach a decision. Ghana's economic situation continued to deteriorate, with the national currency reaching historic lows and inflation showing no signs of slowing down. Every day of delay meant more businesses closing, more families falling into poverty, and more young Ghanaians considering emigration as their only path to economic security. The window for effective intervention was rapidly closing, and everyone involved knew that Ghana's experiment could not afford to fail before it even began. 3 years after the bold decision that shocked the international development community, Ghana hosted the first African Digital Economy Summit in Accra. The irony wasn't lost on observers. The same city, where IMF officials had once lectured about fiscal responsibility, was now teaching other countries how to achieve sustainable economic transformation through strategic technology investments. The summit brought together presidents, prime ministers, and technology leaders from across Africa and beyond. What they found in Ghana challenged every assumption about African technological capability and economic development. The country that had been written off as reckless was now generating economic growth rates that made traditional development models look obsolete. The numbers told a story that even the most skeptical economists couldn't dismiss. Ghana's technology sector was contributing 12% of GDP, employing over 400,000 people directly, and supporting millions more in related industries. The digital hubs had spawned over 15,000 technology companies, many of which were expanding across West Africa and generating foreign exchange earnings that exceeded traditional export commodities. But statistics only captured part of the transformation. The real story was visible in the confident faces of young Ghanaians who were building global businesses from their home communities. Emmanuel Osei, who had started as a student in the first Digital Ghana hub in Kumasi, was now running a software company that provided services to banks across Africa. His company employed 200 people and was opening offices in Lagos, Dakar, and Nairobi. The international development community had been forced into a fundamental rethink of their approaches to African economic development. The World Bank published a comprehensive study of Ghana's transformation, concluding that strategic technology investments could deliver better results than traditional aid programs. The IMF, which had initially opposed Ghana's digital gamble, now offered technical assistance to other countries seeking to replicate Ghana's success. Regional transformation was perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Ghana's experiment. The Economic Community of West African States established a digital integration initiative based on Ghana's model, aimed at creating a seamless technology ecosystem across the region. Young people from neighboring countries were traveling to Ghana for training and education, then returning home to launch similar initiatives. The success had also attracted global attention from countries far beyond Africa. Delegations from Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe visited Ghana to study how a relatively small country had achieved such rapid technological advancement. Ghana began exporting technical expertise and consulting services, generating revenue from knowledge rather than just natural resources. However, the government remained vigilant about the challenges that success could bring. Rapid economic growth was creating inequality and social tensions that required careful management. The influx of international investment was putting pressure on local communities and traditional ways of life. Urban areas were booming while some rural regions struggled to keep pace with change. President Akufo-Addo, now in his final term and widely regarded as one of Africa's most successful leaders, reflected on the journey during his address to the Digital Economy Summit. He acknowledged that the 367 million gamble could have failed catastrophically, but argued that Ghana's willingness to take calculated risks had been essential to breaking free from cycles of dependency and stagnation. The transformation had fundamentally changed Ghana's relationship with the international community. Instead of being aid recipients or junior partners in economic relationships, Ghanaians were now dealing with international partners as equals, who brought valuable capabilities and expertise to the table. This shift in power dynamics had implications that extended far beyond economic transactions. Educational achievements provided perhaps the strongest foundation for long-term success. Ghana's universities were now attracting students from across Africa and beyond, creating a new generation of technological leaders who would shape the continent's future. The brain drain that had plagued Ghana for decades had reversed, with diaspora Ghanaians returning home and international talent relocating to take advantage of opportunities. The cultural impact was equally profound. Ghana's success had changed narratives about African capability and potential, inspiring young people across the continent to believe that technological leadership was possible in their own countries. The phrase African solutions for African problems had gained new credibility as Ghana demonstrated that homegrown strategies could succeed where externally imposed models had failed. Looking ahead, Ghana faced new challenges that success inevitably brings: competition from other countries adopting similar strategies, the need to continuously innovate and stay ahead of technological changes, and the responsibility of leading continental transformation efforts while managing domestic development needs. The $367 million that had seemed like such an enormous gamble 3 years earlier now appeared as one of the shrewdest investments in Ghana's history. That money had leveraged billions in additional investment, created hundreds of thousands of jobs, and positioned Ghana as a leader in Africa's technological revolution. More importantly, it had proven that developing countries could chart their own course to prosperity without following predetermined paths laid out by international institutions. As the summit concluded, participants returned to their countries carrying more than just ideas and strategies. They carried proof that transformation was possible, that African countries could compete globally in high-value sectors, and that bold leadership combined with strategic vision could achieve results that conventional wisdom said were impossible. Ghana's digital gamble had succeeded beyond all expectations, but perhaps more significantly, it had changed what was considered possible for African economic development. The ripple effects of that $367 million decision would continue shaping the continent's future for generations to come, proving that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all.